Well, hello everyone. I'm Gabe Wilson. I'm the Curator of Exhibitions and Collections here at Braun, and I'm so pleased that y'all decided to join me tonight. So, I am excited to spend the next little while discussing an exhibition I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to curate. Before I do that, though, I want to extend my and the museum's gratitude to Chip and Monica Perry. Many of the paintings currently hanging in Coast to Coast are drawn from their personal collection, and Braun is fortunate to count a number of astute and dedicated collectors, like the Perrys, among its supporters. Collectors of art with focused passion and drive are not only compelled to hunt for and add new works to their collections, but are also voracious consumers of information and history related to the artworks that they share their lives with. These do-it-yourself art historians bring an enthusiasm and curiosity to their work that is refreshing to a jaded professional like myself. Well, maybe not jaded, but certainly constrained by the limitations of time and the impressive array of exhibitions and projects a museum of Braun's size endeavors to complete. Collectors like Chip have the luxury of the deep dive, exploring every facet, nuance, and hidden fact about an image or an object, and I am the beneficiary of that boundless curiosity. My scholarly and professional education has trained me to look at artworks in a specific way, to accessibly and efficiently provide context. Brevity is, unfortunately, more often than not, the name of the game. Many of you already know me and my resume of qualifications. Instead, I'd like to briefly share my own relationship to Impressionist painting and how it relates to the museum's current exhibition, Coast to Coast, Contrasts and Shared Values Across American Impressionism. Throughout my undergraduate and graduate career, my scholarly research and analysis was largely rooted in three overarching thematics: landscape theory, romantic nationalism, and intentional artist communities. I applied these lenses very narrowly. With the tools of art history, I analyzed the late modern cultural and political milieu of the Kingdom of Hungary and the Austro-Hungarian Empire across the long 19th and early 20th centuries. The site at which these three rubrics of inquiry intersected most succinctly was in the late Impressionist painting that proliferated across Hungary between the 1880s and 1910. I'll save the minutiae of this topic for a lecture I'm planning to present at Braun in the future, but to paint the picture broadly, Impressionism was a movement that emerged in Western Europe, France in particular, as many of us know, and traveled at varying speeds outward. This expansion was propelled by a number of factors, including the geographic movement of artists to train, teach, and make new work, market conditions as regional art economies shifted in taste and a growing middle class gained the means to purchase art, and, most central to my interests, cultural ideologies that were naturally aligned with the ethos of the Impressionist movement. Thank you, Lee. At its core, Impressionism is a genre naturally suited for depictions of landscape, capturing the conditions of a momentary space and time, human perception and experience, the reality and mutability of light, and the worthiness of mundane subjects are all essential elements to the style. Hungarian painters, particularly those of the artist colony at Nagybanya, a Transylvanian village now located in Romania, sought to lay claim to Hungarian lands under imperial control, the very soil itself, by producing paintings that integrated their vision of national identity with depictions of the land that they were rooted in experience. Emotive vistas were a window into the soul of their country. I am radically reducing the framework of this argument, but to be brief, it is within this tension between aesthetic and political concerns that we can begin to see the meaningful possibilities for a nationalist reading of Impressionism. I say all of this because I hope it gives you all a small understanding of my very particular perspective when I began exploring this exhibition theme and the works on display therein. Not unlike my example of Hungary's Nagybanya painters, American Impressionism also proved itself to be a valuable tool in articulating the nation as both a conceptual and a physical reality. Further, we are able to see this ideological development as the style and movement makes its way across the country from east to west between the 1880s and the two world wars. Coast to Coast draws connections across Impressionist painting as it was practiced on opposite sides of America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on the artists who made the journey, some permanent, some temporarily, and how the relationships that emerged between them led to a dynamic and often divergent approach to plein-air painting. Questions of style, training, the commercial market, and even the physical landscape itself emerge as a network of conditions that encouraged a vibrant departure from East Coast Impressionism. This is the text I wrote to introduce visitors to the exhibition you'll find downstairs in Braum's Rankin West Gallery. The market for ideas, innovations, and new methods of portraying the world around them was a valuable currency between artists at the turn of the 20th century, just as it is today. And the notes of this currency naturally evolved as they traveled through time and from place to place. Moreover, as a genre chiefly interested in capturing the natural world in two dimensions, it would necessarily shift and refocus depending on the artist's environment. But I would now take my thesis for this exhibition one step further. Where Impressionism served primarily as a mode of seeing the world on the East Coast, a fashionable style that was taken up by successful artists for its aesthetic potential and cultural cachet, the movement took on increasingly political and spiritual implications as it traveled west, becoming a mode of experience and perception. Impressionism more broadly was still a relatively novel approach to painting when it arrived on American shores. While its emergence in France in the 1870s was initially met with critical derision, by the 1880s, when it began to cross the Atlantic in earnest, the Impressionists had refined and somewhat softened their dogma as the style received increasing acclaim among collectors, critics, and the artistic community at large. Initially, Impressionists eschewed academic painting, the predominant style of the salon and cultural appetites, which prioritized historicizing subjects and idealized representations, in favor of a naturalistic and ephemeral approach to making pictures. Many art historians have attributed this in part to the rise of the photographic techniques in the middle of the 19th century. The world could be captured in its exactness by anyone with a camera. This turn against the prevailing order by young artists was also a product of a psychic reorientation towards the mundane. Great subjects of history, myth, and religion were no longer, at least in their eyes, the only worthy subject for the canvas. Everyday life, the domestic and sometimes the intimate and risque, were worthy in their eyes. Unexpected vantage points and compositional framing were recognized for their ability to bring new insight to an otherwise stale view. These new subjects were predicated on the artist experiencing and perceiving their surroundings deeply. It is no wonder then that this turn would also affect how more traditional landscapes were depicted. Early Impressionist landscapes with the trademark short gestural brushstrokes painted the landscape to create quite literally an impression that prioritized the movement, light, and color of the natural world, capturing its internal dynamism. It is this element that would prove to be foundational for the movement's elevation and depicting a national frontier in America just a few decades later. However, before this new school of Impressionism could travel across America, it first needed to cross the Atlantic. In the years following the Civil War, American art students began traveling abroad to Europe more frequently, most often to Paris. This increase can be attributed to a number of reasons, including the prestige of foreign study, networking opportunities, and the preponderance of masterworks to imitate in European institutions and salons. That being said, plein-air painting and the groundbreaking impressionistic approaches to color and light were generally not learned in the formal schooling these American students undertook while abroad. For anyone wondering, plein-air painting is simply the practice of painting outdoors directly in front of the subject being depicted, first popularized by the Barbizon painting colony in France during the 1830s, and then further popularized by the Hudson Valley School and Impressionists later in the century. While institutions like the Académie Julian and the École des Beaux-Arts remained important sites for developing competencies and the traditionally prized skills of draftsmanship, material and technical expertise, and historical subjects, American students' most radical lessons were learned during summers spent at painting colonies and out of doors amongst a broader milieu of working artists. American students began to establish themselves in these artist colonies first at Barbizon, then at Étaples, Pont-Aven, and Giverny in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. Under the auspices of Claude Monet's fame, Giverny became an especially productive site for the American absorption of Impressionist ideals by the mid-1880s. A number of artists spent significant time painting there, and a handful became so embedded they were regarded and exhibited as the Giverny Group in New York in 1910. One artist exhibited in Coast to Coast, Guy Rose, who we'll take a closer look at in a little bit, was a part of this group of 6. Heavy impasto, or the textural relief of paint, a vibrant, lightened palette, and fleeting subjects of nature and domestic life were all hallmarks of the movement that were taken up by Americans initiated into this contemporary style. Emerging approaches to depicting landscape color and light, falling within a broader rubric of Impressionist techniques, reached their zenith some 2 decades apart on either coast of America. In New York, with the first exhibition of The 10 in 1898, and in California at the Panama Pacific Exhibition in San Francisco in 1915. This time-lapse can, in many ways, be attributed to distance. At the same time as Impressionism was being established as the prevailing technique in France and as an international style throughout the European continent, the Transcontinental Railroad was reaching San Francisco and then making its way south down the state. Just as the human journey west was slow, so too was the progress of novel ideas in art and design as they made their way to the Pacific. The East Coast's longer history of art education and artistic patronage hastened its contact with European innovation. But the increasing travel between the two coasts around 1900 and the inviting and singularly monumental landscape of the West would prove a tempting subject for plein-air painting. By the turn of the century, internationally trained painters had taken up many of the teaching posts in America's formal institutions of artistic training, and their work became a desirable commodity in the nation's growing art market. This boom in American painting was financed by the burgeoning wealth of the Gilded Age, a period of rapid industrial economic growth across the country. The overwhelming artistic patronage by economic elites is still evidenced in the country's monumental urban museum collections, in which examples of American Impressionism continue to play an important role in the nation's art historical development. As we look at Impressionist examples from America's East Coast, in contrast to that which was being produced in France and would later emerge in California, the palettes are more staid, with muted earth tones often taking precedence over the more vibrant jewel tones that were common among first-generation Impressionists. Naturalism was a key element across the movement, and the East Coast tradition was deeply affected by the urban, wintry climate of New England. Moreover, a competing but complementary impulse that was emerging at the same time was the distinctive brand of American realism. Gritty, soot-covered cityscapes and domestic scenes grew commonplace in the late 19th and early 20th century. East Coast artists were painting for a well-established market that was hungry for fashionable pictures. It is unsurprising then that so many painted abroad, not only bringing European style, but also European scenes back to the continent and their collectors therein. As Impressionist artists and artworks traveled west, they followed a journey that was, by the late 19th century, well mythologized. The Western pioneer movements and continental expansion following the War of 1812 and onwards was chiefly characterized by the pervasive American cultural belief in manifest destiny. That is, the belief that the American people were divinely destined to expand their nation westward. This conviction motivated westward movement while also permeating literature and visual art of the period, and would continue to emerge as a thematic in American creative and political culture well into the 20th century. While the overtly political, sometimes almost cartoonish visual manifestations of manifest destiny common in the first half of the 19th century had largely fallen out of fashion by 1900, some of its ethos persisted in the more poetic form of landscape painting. I argue that this exhibition illustrates its presence and constitutes some of the aesthetic differences between East Coast and West Coast Impressionism. Where Eastern examples were grounded in the reality of their landscape, Western examples were naturally inclined to infuse late 19th century esotericism into their canvases, thereby fusing the spiritual, the political, and the impressionistic in a model that was attractive to modern audiences. It didn't hurt that the actual landscapes of this mythical West were predisposed for these monumental, shimmering depictions. Ultimately, the range of stylistic practices across American Impressionism are relatively narrow. Changes in palette from warm to cool, the density of compositions, and daunting ranges of scale could all be attributed to the natural geological and atmospheric differences between the far ends of a vast landmass. But as always, I do think it is worth our time to wonder at the question, because the further we investigate, the harder we think, and the harder we think, the closer and longer we look at these beautiful examples of American painting. So now we're going to go through a couple case studies that you can see down in the gallery. We'll be starting with these two lovely works by Mary Bradish Titcomb. Mary Bradish Titcomb provides the most illustrative pairing in Coast to Coast. I was thrilled to be able to acquire two examples of her work, both of which are especially descriptive examples of the divergent qualities between East and West Coast style approaches to Impressionist painting. A New Hampshire native, Titcomb attended the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, following a career teaching art in Massachusetts public schools. Her instructors included a number of significant American Impressionists, which likely precipitated her travels to Paris and throughout France in the 1880s, and her subsequent participation in both the Pennsylvania and Connecticut strains of the movement at the Colony of Old Lyme and in Bucks County, respectively. While undoubtedly a product of the East Coast in her choices of subject and her early restrained color palettes, Titcomb was receptive to a diversity of influences during her wide travels and studies. These two paintings by Titcomb, while separated by nearly a decade, serve as a valuable example of the porous movement of artists and stylistic idiosyncrasies across the breadth of the nation. She would travel west in 1915 for the Panama Pacific exhibition in San Francisco, in which she exhibited alongside many key figures in the movement from the eastern seaboard. In Monterey Cypress Coastal, we see a truncated composition that prioritizes key features of the landscape: the lone cypress tree, the cliff's edge, and an iridescent Pacific Ocean. This is, of course, the smaller painting on the right. Further, the painting is suffused with a warm light that is markedly more saturated than her traditional pictures. Just as East Coast practitioners introduced West Coast artists and audiences to Impressionism through exhibitions, teaching appointments, and individual workshops, so too were Western stylistic innovations introduced to visiting artists from the Atlantic. The divergent, warm, and cool palettes you see in these two paintings are one of the most distinct elements that mark California and New England canvases. This can be attributed in part to the natural differences between their landscapes, skylines, and reflected light. Open sky, extended horizons, and undeveloped land made for vastly different vistas and possible compositions on the West Coast. This one's I'm especially fond of. Maurice Braun was born in Hungary. Clearly, I'm biased. Based in San Diego after studying in Europe and on the East Coast, Maurice Braun is regarded as one of the most skillful painters of decorative landscapes during the early period of Southern California art. His work is marked by short brushstrokes, patterned landscapes, and a prismatic execution of light and color. Scholars have asserted that the near mystical qualities of his impressionistic interpretations may be due to his significant involvement in the Theosophical Society, a 19th century American religious and esoteric movement that imbued color theory and emerging ideas around abstraction with their beliefs regarding the physical world and its reflection of an inner cosmology of a single divine absolute. Related to theosophy, transcendentalism, an intertangled spiritual tradition that centered nature with a capital N, not only for its beauty but also as a tool and model for understanding the underlying order of the world, shaped Braun's perception of the physical plane, and his paintings were, quote, expressions of nature's moods rather than purely descriptions of the landscape, end quote. Braun's pictures are some of the most striking in Coast to Coast. He effectively synthesizes the monumental scale of Southern California's landscape, the vibrating light of its open sun-filled skies, and the esoteric experience of going west. Braun's work continues the Romantic painting tradition from the early 19th century of encapsulating America's mandate towards manifest destiny on canvas, but instead roots a sense of place and identity in the meditative features inherent to the land of California. As mentioned, Guy Rose. Painted during the 8 years Rose lived in Giverny, France, The old summer house illustrates the profound influence of friend and mentor Claude Monet on the artist's maturing technique. A California native, Rose had first been introduced to the new school of painting at the San Francisco Art Association's School of Art by eminent Danish-American impressionist Emil Carlsen. Maintaining homes on the West Coast and in Connecticut, Carlsen was a significant force in both coastal iterations of American Impressionism. Pushing Carlsen's legacy further, Rose's palette reflects a more saturated and gauzy rendering of the natural and domestic worlds developed during his time abroad. And this lovely example is by John Jack Frost. The son of successful artist A.B. Frost, the illustrator of Brer Rabbit and other iconic African-American oral traditions, John Frost traveled with his father to Paris at the age of 16 to study at the Académie Julian and then to Pasadena, where his career began in earnest. Likely due in part to his very early exposure to the movement, Frost's work was one of only a few California artists considered to be of pure French Impressionist style. Of this singular approach to the Western landscape, it was written that he was a Californian who, quote, did not hesitate to apply the delicate Impressionist technique to as uncompromising a place as a desert, end quote. Following his father's death, Frost would travel between Pasadena and a home in the suburbs of Philadelphia for the remainder of his life. This bicoastal arrangement presents a useful case study in the painting of both Eastern and Western landscapes in the early 20th century. Autumn Scene, which is another work by Frost that you can see down in the gallery, likely painted near Philadelphia, presents a tonal and rigorously structured interpretation of Eastern Pennsylvania, where the coastal plain meets the Piedmont. On the other hand, Sierra's Scene, which you can see right here, presents a more spacious composition depicting the arid landscape of Southern California in an almost icy palette. I developed this exhibition as a strategy to share Chip and Monica Perry's wonderful collection of California Impressionism. Braun has always been a home for American painting, with a particular emphasis on and passion for American Impressionism, but one that has been largely focused on the East Coast. I hope to leverage our audience's already strong knowledge of Impressionism to broaden their palette. This seemed especially timely as the museum prepares for this summer. In June, Braun will be mounting the first East Coast installation of a prestigious collection of early California art. Gifted, Collecting the Art of California at Gardena High School, 1919 through 1956, will open on June 20th and include 49 major works from the collection occupying both our Fort and Atwell galleries on the first floor. The exhibition boasts an impressive array of examples of California Impressionists, as well as artists who continued to work from and experiment with that legacy all the way through the mid-20th century. Braun is proud to be the next host for this ambitious exhibition and research project, and I hope to see all of you at the public celebration of the show on Saturday, June 24th. So that is the end of my formal talk, but I'm hoping you all have plenty of questions. We can both talk about the work that I've got, the handful of works up here on the screen, and I'm also happy to go down into the gallery with anybody who's interested. So thank you.